In 2013, something happened in China, but what happened indeed? And now we have a speaker that can answer to this question and what happened in China so that China became the largest importer. Well, thank you very much.
It's more easy for me, I think. So, merci beaucoup, Madame Tamar.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, Sorghum-ID, and in particular, Mr. Murluk, for having invited me to talk about Chinese import of sorghum. So I'm pleased to give you some figures on this. Before illustrating the production in China of sorghum, I would like to focus on the notion of cereal in China. Besides the economic importance of cereals in general, the economic size is also important. Cereals in China are a political affair. Political, I would like to underline this adjective, especially, when we talk about cereals in China at all, it's all a question of politics. You know that every time that a new dynasty comes in, that the government changes, the political regime changes, then we have the appearance of specific situations like scarcity, and this is actually rooted in the Chinese culture. There is also a Chinese saying that says that all Chinese know by heart everything. And cereals also do the reasoning with their heart. They are like the sky, and we cannot do without the sky as we cannot do without cereals. So cereals are very important also from a political viewpoint. But going back to our figures regarding production, you see that the three main cereals are corn, wheat from north to south, and rice. The main production areas in corn are in the three northeast biggest provinces, as you can see on the map close to the Russian border. So these are the three main regions where corn is produced. And this is also where soya comes from. The origin of soya is Chinese. China is a big importer, this is true, but this cereal was born in China. And then, corn, we have a production of 270 million tons. And also in the southeast, we do have cereal production, rice, 203 million tons. And then wheat, 123 million tons are produced every year. So these three are three main cereals, and they have a high specificity, i.e. production areas are concentrated mainly in the eastern part of the country. As for rice, well, we find rice crops close to the Yangtze, the largest river in China, so in the southern part of China. Going back to wheat, we'll have a subsidy system that was set in place. So upstream the subsidies, and so producers can count on a set price that is higher than, like, we have guaranteed prices for wheat and corn. 320 euros per ton, roughly. So this is 1/3 more expensive versus these cereals quotations. But my corn now is not anymore in that subsidy system because we had very large stocks, so-called strategic stocks of the Chinese government. So there was a big surplus, and due to these stocks, now there are no subsidies anymore for corn. So this in order to have these strategic stocks being reduced. Let's now focus on sorghum. There are 3 main production areas for sorghum in China. It is the 4th cereal production in China. Even, so 4th place, yes, is important, but if you look at the volumes, the quantities produced, actually it's not so high, 3 million tons. So the ranking is 4th in the ranking, but a very small production, 3.1 million tons in total. Whereas the remaining 3 account for about 500 million tons altogether. So there's no guaranteed price for sorghum, so this is why it is less cultivated. Here you have a map showing the main areas where we find the farms, the feed producing companies, and you see actually that the largest one is based in the eastern parts of the country. Well, for mainly logistic reasons, and Pierre explained to you that China imports sorghum, and it's a big importer since 2014. So almost all sorghum imported in China is processed to become feed, and the main companies and the main processing companies are based around along the coast or in the south. So, but what happened in 2014 when we became a big importer of sorghum? Well, you know, Chinese corn is very expensive, much more expensive than imported sorghum. This is why feed companies in China focused on importing sorghum. Sorghum is imported also from Australia, from Argentina. So in China today, we have 4 main sources for sorghum. So actually the main source is the US, and then Argentina, and also we import from Birmania in terms of Asia. So I wanted to show you this map because it is actually here that but what's interesting is that China is also producing sorghum. 3 million tons is not a little sum. So they produce 3 and there is consumption of 5. So you do have a gap that has to be filled via imports. But you are also a big cereal producer. Yes, you know that Chinese people like to drink, so especially white alcohol. So there's 3 million tons that are produced in China. Well, they are used by the local distilleries producing the so-called white alcohol. It's a matter of taste and of flavor and aroma. Now, we were mentioning, the segmentation of the market, and here you can really see this. There is a local consumption for white alcohol and then the feed industry. So the imported sorghum goes to the feed industry. The locally produced sorghum is used to produce alcohol, so spirits. Yes, we use imported sorghum for feed. So 95% of what is imported is actually used up by the feed industry, whereas the local production is more for local, distilleries. Yes. There are also distilleries in China processing imported sorghum, but these are small quantities, whereas the big spirit manufacturers use Chinese sorghum because of this special aroma. So what will happen then this year with the reduction in terms of sorghum imports from the U.S.? So those safety stocks you were mentioning about, are these stocks high in terms of sorghum? And will Chinese production increase as a consequence, or China will try and diversify the sources of sorghum? So besides the U.S., they will look at other countries to import sorghum. Well, a very complex question. I'll try and answer in a couple of minutes. Well, indeed, as you have explained, Chinese sorghum is used for the production of white alcohol, and the imported one is used for feed production. But what is happening today? Well, we have 25% surplus in terms of duties with the U.S. So we have 170% of duties as a sort of reserve. So this in terms of the relationships with the United States. So as a deposit. So we have this 2 million tons now that we need to sort of find, and the Chinese have decided to reduce also the protein content in feed. This is more related to soya, not so much to sorghum, but it's also another trend. And at the same time, we also import barley for forage. So this is what we've been importing. We don't produce much, we import a lot. And also we import dry residues. In China, we have tried to reduce the local price for corn. So even though we have less sorghum coming from the U.S. in China, well, this is not a big impact for us in terms of the feed industry. So the feed industry will be using other cereals. Now let's move to Ralph. So the United States certainly there with the midterm. So you told us cereals is a political affair. fair.
Oui et non, c'était une affaire politique jusqu'à hier soir.
Well, till last night, because Mr. Trump actually came closer to the farmers also.
So, as you know, we had the midterms election yesterday, and I think the conclusion is that it did not produce the tidal wave from the Democrats that was expected. There have been gains by the Democrats, but not to the extent that were forecast even 2 months ago. So Trump pursued a very high-risk strategy, which he always does, by the way, which is divide and conquer. And divide the electorate, polarize the electorate, and solidify his base. That's his only strategy. And it will be a strategy in 2020 again. He is not interested in making broader, in a broader appeal to the independents or to the women or to some other categories. He is only interested in solidifying his base, which produced the results that were expected. The Democrats took control of the House, mostly because the election for the House, for the representative, is on a purely demographic basis. Give you an example, California has probably 50 representatives in the House, Vermont has only 1. And this trend has been sort of undermining the rural areas in the House and overrepresenting the cities and the suburbs. So this was expected. On the Senate side, on the contrary, Trump made gains. They are going to gain probably 4 or 5 seats to a majority of 55 versus 45 for the Democrats, which is a very good result for Trump. And so the result, the situation, when you look at it's striking when you look at the map. You have the inland USA is red. It's Trump country. It's the rural areas and the blue-collar workers from the manufacturing industry. That's Trump voters. So, and the blue, which are Democrats, of course, is just the 2 coasts. You have the Pacific coast and the eastern part of the Atlantic coast. And so, to a certain extent, you could make the argument that the Democrats, especially since Hillary Clinton, has become the party of the elite. And Trump is rebuilding the Republican Party from the base, from the workers, from the blue collars, and it has become a populist party dominated by Trump and pushing aside the traditional establishment of the country club gentry from the Republican Party. So that's the result of the election. And it's obviously going to impact the trade policy. And je vais dire maintenant quelques mots sur la politique commerciale et la situation, notamment dans les relations avec la Chine, parce que
I will spend a couple of words on China and the relationship US-China, because produce like soya, soybeans and sorghum impacted and are the victims of a conflict. They are completely wiped out, although they have nothing to do with the strategy. And this applies also to the equipment. Yes, that's true. For China, tools are very important, but well, for the US, sorghum and other crops are certainly collateral victims, let's say, of Trump's strategy. And then concerning production, well, I do not think that crop production will be a strategic weapon for the US, especially considering the broader policies. But I do not think that Trump is going to focus on aid to Africa. Well, as far as US and China relationships are concerned, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of that challenge, we'll have to focus on the trade deficit. One of the rare convictions of Trump in terms of politics regards the trade deficit and the trade policy as a whole. So Trump has been writing on trade policy and Back in the 80s, he used to focus on Japan, and now the target has become China. The deficit is $375 billion, with Chinese imports to the U.S. exceeding 500 billion, and then 130 million exports from China, with about 20 billion in terms of agriculture. So China is one of the best customers for the U.S., and soybeans account for about $13 billion of exports. And then sorghum, $800 million US of export, and sorghum accounts for about 4.5 or 5 million tons. The argument which is being exploited and which has been developed in political terms is the fact that this trade deficit has also an impact on national security and the health of international trade must be considered from the framework of the national security policy. Tools have been implemented that had not been used since Bush administration, since the 90s, and this allows to adopt protectionist measures. The introduction of tariffs, for example, and contingents and limited quotas. Trump made a decision on steel, for example, the introduction of tariffs on steel and aluminum coming from any countries, including China. All these tariffs are now in force. There will be countermeasures for sure. China has adopted countermeasures so far, and the same applies to the European Union. Despite all negotiations, despite the agreement with Canada and Mexico, still duties, still tariffs are still in place. With China, there have been two retaliation measures. The first is the introduction of steel duties, as I said, and the second retaliation concerns property rights. 200 billion penalties on Chinese products. And with that, well, Chinese have, of course, taken countermeasures for 130 billion, including all the U.S. exports, or 90% of U.S. exports. As far as soybean is concerned, well, the duty moved and increased from 2 to 28%. The two duties, both property rights and steel, increased. As for sorghum, we've reached 27%, and maize 90%. These are penalties that are extremely high and that, of course, have an impact on trade as a whole. However, we have to say that no negotiations have been pursued since this summer between the U.S. and China, so there are no negotiations at all. Twice, ministers were sent to China because we thought China was needed in order to solve the problem with Northern Korea. Now this problem is no longer there, so the Chinese can be treated in a worse way. And then the Americans went to Beijing, and a short-term agreement was drawn up. According to this agreement, China undertook to reduce a deficit by $100 billion while buying and taking over some crops. But Trump rejected the short-term agreement, denied what was negotiated by the ministers. And so we've realized that the real negotiator here is Trump and nobody else. And this, of course, hampers the negotiations and the good relationship among countries. The Chinese and American relationships have worsened throughout the past months and also go beyond mere trade issues. We have issues issues, for example, concerning the reduction of Chinese investments in America, especially as far as technology is concerned. We've had a reduction of 95% in terms of Chinese products, and this is, of course, very significant. And then there are military operations, spying issues. There are many questions and many issues that have to be faced, and that make trade relationships even worse. What does Trump want for the time being? Well, as far as the administration is concerned, his ministers are really split on this issue. There are tensions and there are issues where the administration is a bit more flexible, and other issues on which the administration is not willing to negotiate. Well, for example, what went wrong in the 80s with Japan is going wrong with China as well. The original sin, according to Trump, was that because was the entry in the WTO, the entry of China into the WTO, and for this reason it is the World Trade Organization which has to be blamed, because while accepting China as a new member, it opened up the world trade to China. China was moving toward a market economy. That was the basic idea. So this was a different approach than the centralized state economy. But what we can realize today, especially since the new Chinese president, is that exactly the opposite is happening. And this is also shared by the whole public opinion in America. One of the biggest successes of Trump is the ability to create a large consensus in the U.S. public opinion. So China now or never again. So now decisions have to be made as far as China is concerned, and we have to decide today who the economic leader is going to be. This is what Trump maintains. What are the concrete impacts for agriculture on this for this new political framework in the U.S.? We see that there is an impact on exports, so there's an impact on trade, but there must be an impact also from the production side. The U.S. is a worldwide player as far as crop exports are concerned, especially to China. What is going to happen? The exports are going to be redirected towards other countries, and what decisions will be made for sorghum, for example? Are U.S. farmers going to say, okay, let's focus on sorghum because we no longer have China as our leading partner? Are they going to move to other productions? If you wish, we can consider sorghum and soybean. As for soybean, we are talking about $12 billion of exports. So stocks are going to increase, for sure, but part of U.S. exports will be redirected. The global effect will be lower than 10% according to the U.S. So there will be a redirection of exports, as we said. Juncker is also a leading player. He undertook to buy more soybean, but I don't think Juncker is going to buy that soybean quantities. So exports to Europe are going to increase, but they will not offset the losses due to China. Another impact is also due to the fact that soybean prices have decreased. So the yield for the next marketing year for soybean will be lower than for other producers. The cropland for soybean increased by 15 million acres in the past years, but we're going to focus a little bit more on maize. This will have an impact for 2-3 million hectares, I think. As far as sorghum is concerned, as we said earlier, we mentioned 2013 and 2014 and what happened during these period. One of the causes of the problems we've had is the restricted import on maize, and then we have GMO issues. The US didn't want to have problems with genetically modified organisms, unauthorized organisms, but I think the barriers are less limiting than the ones imposed on maize. Again, in this case, too, there will be a redirection to Europe. It is estimated that exports to Spain will double, and sorghum will be increasingly produced for the ethanol production. Trump undertook to increase by 15% the rate of use of ethanol for fuel, for gasoline, and this will have an impact on sorghum production because 15% of sorghum will be used for bioethanol. This means that the industry has to align to this new approach, replacing maize with sorghum. I don't know how it works perfectly. And then we have the Spaniards. Spain used to have a refinery in Texas. There are many players with this, focusing on this activity. I'd like to hand over to Lee, who may reply to all these issues, and then I will hand over to Leandro because there are also important effects on Argentina.
Juste quelques petits éléments par rapport à la guerre commerciale entre la Chine et les États-Unis.
I'd like to add a couple of additional information on the trade war between the United States and China. I will speak from the perspective of China, of course. Well, in China, we can say that the trade war that we are currently experiencing is an effect that derives from another cause. The real cause is a political strategic war between China and the United States. And why that? Because in 2015, when the Chinese government approved the economic plan of that period, well, the Chinese government defined some priorities. He set some priorities on specific sectors to further develop. Let me explain. They wanted to encourage innovation first, artificial intelligence, digital technologies, aerospace, and technology as a whole. It is argued that China has to increase the quality of its industrial products, but this also includes agricultural produce. So since 2015, we have started diversifying our sourcing origins, drawing to Russia, to the Black Sea, especially as far as soybean is concerned. Again, in 2015, when the 10-year development plan was issued, we focused on streamlining and optimizing our economic structure in general. As you know, the United States is trying to refrain Chinese exports to the US as much as possible. However, the Chinese government focused on sustainable development, and they decided to focus on organic production. In order to achieve all the targets we've set, we defined 3 deadlines. By 2025, in particular, China should become one of the most industrialized countries with made-in-China production, with local manufacturing. Then, second deadline, by 2035, China should be aligned with the average in industrialized country worldwide in terms of manufacturing production. And the third deadline is 2045, the 110th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. So China would become the first industrialized country worldwide. So we have to focus on modern industrial facilities, and we also have to focus on defense. The Chinese government and Chinese authorities are striving to defend and protect the internal wealth, so we have to focus much more on defense. The US administration instead said, oh, let's give up your plan. If you want to become the main exporter of specific goods, you should not do this and that, or you should not focus on high-tech products. Well, this is not your sector. And the Chinese president replied to Trump, no, Mr. Trump, no, we are Chinese, you are American, and we have the right, as you have, we have the right to improve in this respect. We have the right to decide how we want to develop ourselves and how we want to develop ourselves at best. That's the reason for the war, from the perspective of the Chinese, of course, and that's the reason for the trade war. As I said, so the trade war is not a cause, but rather an effect. The real cause are the Americans, or better still, the current US administration trying to block China so that China cannot become a worldwide trade power. Leandro, you have now the floor. I'm sorry. We do not have time. So first of all, Leandro, and then we have some time left. I will give the floor back to you. So, Leandro, we've talked extensively about trade policies, trade conflicts, commodities, raw materials may be an instrument or the victim of specific policies. What about Argentina? Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today. So it's a great satisfaction for me to be present here today, but I will speak in French. So, first of all, I'd like to show you the pluses, the advantages of sorghum in Argentina, and the weaknesses we have in Argentina. So it would be great to talk about the pros and cons of sorghum at a worldwide level. But I'd like to focus on Argentina, which is a good example of that. Sorghum is a traditional crop, and Argentinian farmers know sorghum very well. You see in blue the exports. In the 60s and 70s, we tripled exports of sorghum at a worldwide level. So 3 times as much as compared to the baseline, to the initial period. And this trend went on till the 70s. We even reached 3 million hectares, as you can see on the red line, in the early 70s. But then the trend decreased after the mid-1970s. And this is due to the fluctuations in sorghum. Corn and rice, however, became much more competitive at that period, and that's the reason for the decrease. Argentina decreased and reduced the pace of planting this cereal. But then the situation recovered at the end of the 1970s, as you can see in the chart. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to go back to some of the issues concerning the trade and economical war that Ralph and Lee mentioned earlier. Let's have a look at the situation in the late 1970s and 1979, the Afghanistan invasion by the Soviet Union. Jimmy Carter in January 1990 foresaw that period, the introduction of an embargo. The USA even drafted a 5-year plan with the Soviet Union, 25 million tons of wheat per year. Jimmy Carter reached 8 million. So the production was not sufficient back then. And this is the reason why we increased exports significantly and our production as well, because we exported 5.4 million tons of sorghum. So 8 for sorghum and 10 for maize. Once the embargo was withdrawn, the situation decreased. So once the embargo was stopped, exports slackened, then soybean increased, and also wheat. Finally, we have one last rebound with 1 million. And so we reach 3 million tons with 42% of production in 2012-2013, when this accounts for almost half of the world market for sorghum. Why this recovery? This is due to internal reasons. Exports started to be taxed. Quotas were imposed on sorghum and maize exports, and the only cereal, for rice and maize, and the only cereal that was not subject to taxes then was sorghum, and this is the reason for the increase in exports in 2015. Then all quotas were removed again, and from that period onward, sorghum was abandoned for the benefit of maize. What I'd like to show you is the following chart. Pierre described the trade relationships very well at an international level, and you see the role of China. China entered the sorghum market, and as we all know, in the beginning, this was a great opportunity for China. Main outlets were Japan, of course, and Chile, Colombia. But what happened when China accessed that market? Well, sorghum became too expensive, and so Chile, Colombia, and other Southern American countries focused on maize to the detriment of sorghum. A protocol was signed in November 2014, and this represented great opportunities for our country, especially in mid-2015. However, afterwards, a less profitable period occurred. Again, well, the protocol, the plant treatment protocol that was signed led to many benefits. I will go back to this later. Unfortunately, I do not have so much time to expand on this issue, but I just would like to tell you that sorghum is for us a very valuable crop, which is highly resistant to drought and which offers many trade opportunities. As far as sorghum production in Argentina is concerned, we have a good production, $530 per hectare against $730 per hectare for late maize. But what's the difference between sorghum and maize, and what's the gap? What is missing in sorghum? In white, you see, at the bottom, you see sorghum and corn on the top. So why did corn develop in areas in the center-south of Argentina that used to be the main areas for sorghum? What happened? Biotechnologies were really a revolution for Argentina. We started planting it in September, October, and thanks to biotechnologies, we managed to plant corn at a later stage. It is the so-called late corn planted in December. Instead of planting in warmer periods, we allowed blossoming and blooming to occur in February. Late maize provided stable yield compared to early corn or early maize that used to be planted in September. Great resistance to drought and also great resistance to pests. Again, so where due to pests, maize cannot be planted, now it is possible to do so. And where sorghum used to be planted previously, now there is corn. Farmers know corn much better. They know how to plant it and where to plant it. They are much more familiar with the internal market. They know where corn is used. Why don't we use sorghum, for example, for bioethanol when considering that it can be used for bioethanol? Let me explain the reason for that. We have to better adjust the production to do so, and we have to do so by focusing on different varieties that are not always well known to the farmers. When farmers plant their seeds, when they invest and when they want to sell, they often do not meet the market to do so. Going back to the President's words this morning, it is very important to disseminate knowledge and good practices in the field of sorghum. Sorghum is a formidable crop that can provide incredible advantages. Oh, that's the noise of Argentina. Don't be afraid. This is Argentinian passion. But unfortunately, we cannot hear.
Voilà. C'est la concurrence des cultures qui font beaucoup de bruit. Donc, c'est important que le marché.
No, these are our competitors that have become very loud. But, well, follow-up question. You mentioned biotechnologies, you mentioned genetics and the internal competition between corn and sorghum, and this applies not only to Argentina but also to other countries, considering that there are different prices, different retail prices. There's competition within the same market for the same uses, for the same outlets. How can genetics play a role for developing sorghum in order to better differentiate the market segments? Let me give you an example. In 2011, Argentina changed its trade standard for the domestic market. And so today we have a market segmentation that could become even deeper. We could subdivide sorghum based on color, based on the amount of tannin, so red or white, based on the amount of tannins. We could really create batches based on color, based on the amount of tannins. But what is missing? What we miss is a well-organized market. Prices should be better defined. If we have a look at Australian prices, if you have a look at Technis prices, and if we compare them with Argentinian ones, we realize that we may have opportunities. Is it good or bad news that our prices are $40 lower than US prices? What does that mean for us? For a producer, for a farmer, this means that the price of $118 for sorghum has to be compared with $147 for maize. And when we see these figures, when we see the slide, well, we have to realize that we have a problem. 120 versus 145, let's say, approximately. We are 400, 500 kilometers away from ports, and so we have to well, Pesos allows for more favorable prices, but we also have to consider transportation costs. $50 out of $41 for a ship freight from us to Shanghai. So logistics costs have a major impact, and especially with our competitors such as the United States and Australia, concerning sorghum, of course, in terms of freight costs. Again, road transportation is also a huge impact. 400, 500 kilometers are many. We are trying to focus on railway transportation, which is less expensive. But in a nutshell, we have a great handicap, a great trade handicap, because we do not receive enough signs from the international market to react. But now that the US is exporting less, isn't this an important market signal that you should capitalize on? This is what we should discuss today. I was talking about this with Lee earlier. We are resuming our negotiations with the Chinese authorities, and we hope we can reach a positive agreement. China invested $21 million in Argentina in 2016. Investments reached $1.3 billion. Chinese investments are really significant. Were they infrastructures and ports? Yes, infrastructures and renewable energies. We will certainly find an agreement. Our wish, however, is the following one. We have a plant treatment protocol, as we all know, and as Lee also knows. You can be a traditional supplier. You can also be an outsider. From the viewpoint of sorghum, we are outsiders. And what do we have in this respect? The protocol forbids us to export sorghum for human feeding. So we cannot export what we would like to export. We can export sorghum for industrial processing purposes, presumably for feeding, for the feeding industry, for feedstuffs. And I'm talking about exports from Argentina to China. We cannot export sorghum for human feeding, for seeding or for human feeding. Sorghum has to be previously processed. That we also have issues with quarantine. There are weeds that have to be included in the quarantine. We have one weed, one type of weed, which is particularly dangerous, chance grass, and well, that weed can be controlled, let's say. The real problem, however, is that there are additional costs that have to be incurred. A selection has to occur prior to exporting sorghum. There is no zero risk situation. We do have opportunities, but these opportunities have to be grasped. What about the export conditions? Are they going to become milder? No, I don't think so. As of today, in China, we decided to make health requirements even more stringent. We know that in China we had major issues with health care, and we had main problems for baby health care. There were casualties among babies due to contaminated milk. And then other problems arose due to genetically modified corn from the United States. Some problems with specific varieties, MIR 162 if I'm not wrong. Again, in this case, some products are not authorized in China, and this leads, of course, to problems. Recently, too, we had issues and problems for health safety with a type of milk from New Zealand for baby nutrition. This led the Chinese authorities. This is very recent, by the way. It occurred 5 months ago. Again, the Chinese government decided to merge Chinese companies dealing with healthcare issues into one single institution, acting as a watchdog over products. We also introduced quarantine that is used in order to obtain healthcare protection. The Chinese authorities decided to make healthcare safety requirements even more stringent, and this does not apply to Argentina only. It's a general requirement. Is this going to become a major difficulty for sorghum exports? I think Ralph would like to add something, but I also would like to ask a question as far as Europe is concerned, so that we can conclude our discussion on Europe. Well, I think that Chinese strategy was focusing on Europe as well, on China, on Russia, and again, new sorghum imports are coming from Russia. That's the question. Yes, I've got your point. Considering what happened with soybean coming from the United States, well, we have to say that the Chinese market is a very peculiar one. But most players, most stakeholders are state-owned companies, and this is a peculiarity of the Chinese domestic market. Sometimes the government itself make decisions in terms of diversification. We took measures, that's clear. But why not? So why can't we have sorghum from Europe? Well, this is an appeal to the audience. Why not, well, African sorghum imported to China or European sorghum? I mean, in the mid to long term, if the French, the Europeans, all European countries as a whole want to export sorghum to China, why not? This is part of the diversification strategy. This is at least what Beijing was planning. I mean, European sorghum from France, Italy to China.
Well, you know, there was a first level to export as for sorghum. This is already existing. So for sorghum, we need this type of protocol for China. Even though there are no quantity limitations. Yeah, quickly, because we have to conclude. Yes, another element is the economic levels of economic plane, i.e. the sorghum must be coming from France, so from Europe, but also it must be competitive versus, other sources. So if all these requirements are met, why not sorghum coming from Europe? So last word to Ralph. I think that we need to consider this issue also at longer term. 4.5 million tons towards China. It's not for tomorrow. You know, in light of all the problems that are to be solved today, I don't think that a dinner between Xi and Trump can solve all the problems and issues between China and the US. So it will take time, a lot of time. So duties will still remain for a few years. I don't think that we can solve this problem till 2020. One last word. Well, I am convinced that we will have a higher and higher production in Europe. I don't think that Europe can develop this crop. But we need to always remind that farmers have to work on this. So signals must come from the market, of course, because with no signals from the market, there is no production. Today, we can think about a 30% share for 2020. So sorghum is actually a crop that is quite interesting, but it needs to have a solid basis. It's not just a matter of having a dinner between two heads of government. So really, we need a very strong supply chain, and this is what is missing in Argentina. So organization, segmentation of the market. Thank you very much to all the four of you. A big applause. And one last speech. We have already a 10-minute delay.
Question to Mr. Lee. He mentioned there an interesting thing. He said first European protocol, and then for sure he said, yeah, but French sorghum. To Mr. Lee, when do you see that China is ready to make a European protocol for sorghum, not a country-wise protocol? That would be a first step.
Merci beaucoup pour monsieur.
Well, thank you very much for your question. I'm not a Chinese negotiator, so first of all, I cannot negotiate with the European Union, but as I explained to you, there are two different levels to export sorghum to China. We have the government level, so, administration level, so between China importing. So we can think about Europe or Italy. So these are. So it's all a matter of the bodies in charge, and importers cannot do much. And then when the agreement between the two governments is signed, so it's a matter of the government level, also on the basis of what importers are doing. I don't know whether I explain myself well, but I think that you need to follow sort of a path, step by step, at the European Union level for this dossier, for this protocol. For the time being, we have a mixed commission. Between a mixed commission, China, EU for this protocol. So it's EU exporters that have to apply to the Brussels authorities.